if I were addressing the nation, I would mention that we have artificially stimulated both supply and demand. We've brought all the demand forward. We've oversupplied, and we really need to flush out the system.
Welcome to Rethinking the Dollar. Today I'm excited to have my guest, Mr. Louis Cammarosano, the creator of Smuggle.com. Today he's sitting down with us to give us his take on the dollar, as well as the role of precious metals in the days ahead. Over at Smuggle.com, Louis focuses on the latest news in global precious metals, as well as current economic news and events. So, Louis, welcome to Rethinking the Dollar.
Oh, thanks for having me on, Michael.
I appreciate you sitting down with me. I saw a couple of your recent videos, and it seems like there's somewhat of a run on the mint these days. And so I'm looking forward to getting your take on that. I know you do heavy research in covering precious metals. And also want to get your take on the dollar, the Federal Reserve note, AKA. So before we get started, I like to start off RTD with some RTD questions. And the first one is, what comes to mind when Louis hears the words rethinking the dollar?
Okay, when I hear rethinking the dollar, what immediately comes to mind is full faith and credit. That's kind of what the dollar is all about. And what reminds me of is the Greenspan quote. I don't know if you saw it a while back. He was being questioned on one of the financial shows about whether Treasury bonds were still a good place to be, given that the United States had massive debts and it might be difficult, to pay it back. And his response was, the United States can always pay because they can always print the dollars to pay. Right. They can always print more. And I thought that was kind of an astounding admission from a former Federal Reserve chairman. But it also highlights, my view, probably yours, what the dollar means is it means what the United States says it means and can be printed in whatever quantities are required. And it has value only as much as people are willing to use it as a medium of exchange and as a currency for international transactions.
All right, good point there. And just as a little testament of that, every system in the world is based upon the same concepts. And so at some point, I would think people will begin to ask questions as to why currencies all around us seem to be failing, but yet the U.S. dollar is the only one that appears to be strong. So I think eventually that faith and credit and confidence will be tested, of course, and hopefully it won't be too late to educate a few. So thank you for sharing your thoughts on that right there. Now, how important is it, in your opinion, for people to begin taking an interest in these matters from an educational standpoint?
I think it's very important, but Michael, what I see is that people have been dumbed down financially. They don't understand value. When you talk about what's happening recently, they're trying to remove cash. That'll make people even less understand value because they won't even have the paper that has no intrinsic value, but at least it represents some value in their hands in order to understand what they're exchanging. Because when you just have a card and you swipe it, you don't really understand what you're swiping for, what the price is. And recently, there's been a lot of automatic deductions. So people don't actually pay attention to their finances in a way where they get to understand it. And of course, they don't understand the dollar that underlies it. They just understand that there's a card or an automatic deduction that gets the stuff they need. But, Michael, maybe 50, 100 years ago, the average person used to go and negotiate the price with the local grocer. Right. They understood the value of what they were going to buy, and they had the money in their pocket, and they understood what that money was worth when they went to exchange it. Today, people don't have that concept of value. So it's very difficult for people to understand even what the dollar means when they have limited understanding of what value is and the price of things.
All right, good point there. Now, last question before we get into more of your field as far as the precious metals and more dollar information. If Louis Cammarasano was given a chance to give what I'll consider the global state of the economy address, if all TVs nationwide was tuned into your channel and you had to address the people on where we're at currently, what would you say and why?
Well, I would say that we're at a point where we've got artificial demand and we have artificial supply. Both of those are out of balance because back in 2008, when the financial system basically collapsed, demand came to a crawl because all that wealth was wiped away, so people didn't have money to buy things. So what they did was artificially tried to boost the economy through QE. So they printed more and more dollars, and they extended and they lowered interest rates in order to extend credit. And when you extend credit and at those levels, it's an artificial level of interest, and it was done to get people to buy stuff. Okay, so people start to buy stuff, and that they don't have the money for, but because of the low interest rates, they get to buy it.
Mm-hmm.
Similarly, with the low interest rates, companies start to invest in producing things that people are going to buy on credit but can't necessarily afford. And I think the best example is what's happened with the shale oil. We had massive amounts of artificial investment or overinvestment in the shale oil on the assumption that people could buy all that oil. But really, the economy is only being pushed up by the amount of money that people can spend on credit. And now what we have is a classic imbalance of supply and demand. And I think that's where, if I were addressing the nation, I would mention that we have artificially stimulated both supply and demand. We've brought all the demand forward. We've oversupplied, and we really need to flush out the system and allow things to reach a natural level of supply and demand rather than this artificial level of trying to force people to buy things that they can't afford and trying to force companies to produce stuff that people can't afford.
Right. Now, you mentioned flush out the system. That sounds pretty harsh. What would flush out the system actually look like, and what would it feel like if you flush out the system?
Well, I think what you would do is you'd allow, and rather than setting interest rates, allow the market to set interest rates and allow the market to determine what the proper rate of interest is, what the proper value of money is, and allow companies to go bankrupt and see where it reaches its natural level. Now, the reason they don't do that is there's an incredibly painful period. The more you artificially stimulate an economy, the more you have to keep pumping it up with more cheap credit. But at some point, you've brought all that demand forward. People can't buy anymore, and they have to pay back their debts, and they can't buy any more stuff, and everything kind of comes to a crawl. So what I would do is basically nothing. I would have the central bank step back and allow the market to recorrect on its own and find its own natural level.
All right, good point there. Now let's talk a little bit about the legal tender note, known as the Federal Reserve note. Where do you think that idea or that piece of paper or currency note stands globally right now? How are the Russians and the Chinese and all those Middle Eastern countries viewing the Federal Reserve note right now?
Well, I think in 2008, when the Federal Reserve initiated quantitative easing, that kind of was a wake-up call to the countries around the world that use the United States dollar international currency. And as you know, Michael, the U.S. dollar used to be backed by gold until 1971 based on the Bretton Woods agreements, where American citizens didn't have gold, but foreign central banks could come to the United States and redeem their dollars for gold. So the U.S. dollar was in effect as good as gold. However, in the late 60s, early 70s, we found that a lot of countries were concerned that the United States wasn't good for the gold, so there was kind of a run on the gold in the late 60s, early 70s, and President Nixon unilaterally, in August of 1971, decided enough was enough, because if the United States kept paying out gold for dollars, they wouldn't have any gold left. So he, quote, closed the gold window in a televised address to the nation. And so the dollar since then has not been backed by anything. And what they did quickly in a couple of years is they decided, in order to give confidence to the dollar, they want to make it widely used. So they worked out agreements with the OPEC nations and Saudi Arabia that they would price their oil in dollars, thus creating demand for dollars, and also only accept dollars in the payment for oil. So that created I wouldn't say an artificial demand, but kind of a fiat order demand that you must use the dollar. So therefore, the dollar's value was based on having to have it rather than wanting to have it. Because when it was gold, you wanted to have it,
Right.
but when you need it for oil, you have to have it. What we've seen since 2008, a lot of the countries are kind of annoyed that they've accumulated dollars because they have to have them. But then the Federal Reserve through QE went through a process of devaluing the dollar by basically printing 4 trillion of them to bail out the United States real estate industry, because they bought with about $2 trillion worth of mortgage-backed securities off the banks. And then they also printed treasuries, printed money to buy newly issued treasury securities to the tune of about $2 trillion. So the dollar started to become, these countries started to make arrangements to, quote, de-dollarize and perhaps use currencies that are not the dollar, at least for local or regional transactions.
Right. Or just use their own.
Russia and China and so on.
Right, or just use their own. I mean, it seems like, I read an article that there's 20 nations or so that decided to basically just, do trade amongst themselves in their own currencies. So it seems like that might be the next move, and then eventually perhaps, back some of those currency notes up with some form of metal. So interesting. It's going to be interesting to see how things play out in the days ahead. Now, recently, or not long ago rather, on your site, you created a blog post in regards to the cashless society. So I want to touch on that a little bit. What are your thoughts on cashless society? Is it possible? Is it something we can foresee? And then also share your thoughts about, getting rid of the $100 bill, as you mentioned earlier.
Well, I think the cashless society is certainly possible. It's the manner in which it's being pushed. To a degree, technology and culture leads us to convenience of using things other than cash as medium exchange, because rather than lugging gold around or coins or a bunch of paper, having your money digitized is convenient. The frightening part, though, is not that they're allowing it to happen naturally and for people to be able to select how they want to transact without cash. They're trying to mandate it. And the reason they're trying to mandate it, Michael, is it's part of their policy. One, they want to control everything and see what's going on and be able to tax every transaction. And two, because of their policies of low interest rates and now negative interest rates, they know that if they want to use negative interest rates, what will happen is people will just hoard cash rather than have their money erode in the bank. Because if you, under negative interest rates, if you put money in the bank and you have to pay for it to be there, you might as well keep it at home or put it in a storage box or put it somewhere else.
Right.
So they're forcing the cashless society. They're trying to say, the central planners are trying to say, it's for convenience, it's for to combat crime and terrorism. But really what it's about is control. That's how I view it. And that's the danger of it. And when they start talking about, you mentioned the $100 bill, Europe started talking about eliminating the $500 bill. And now Larry Summers, former Treasury Secretary, is talking about eliminating the $100 bill. Now, Zero Hedge had an interesting point in this. If you take all the cash in circulation, the $100 bill amounts for the bulk of the actual value of cash. If removing that is basically removing a lot of cash and one step towards kind of a cashless society. And the other thing is, when you go to your bank, Michael, they don't have your money there. They have a very small amount of cash there in the first place.
Right.
So there's already a cash shortage. And so people accept the concept of this fractional reserve banking, that somehow when you put money in the bank, you're putting a deposit in. You're not. You're loaning the bank money. People don't look at it that way. They look at it as, I have money in the bank. I've deposited it there. No, your money is not there. The money is, you've lent the bank money, and if the bank goes under, or if the bank doesn't have your cash when you go in to get it, they may not give it to you, which is frightening, because I've heard of people going to the bank and trying to take out relatively large amounts, a few $1,000s, and the bank either doesn't have it, or they ask them 50, 60 questions. Why do you need the money?
All right. Why do you want your own money?
Why do you need your money?
Interesting. Now, do you foresee a day where, since I've kind of, with the whole rethinking the dollar concept, I've kind of, in a sense, charted how we went from metal to paper and metal, to paper, and then now they're trying to get rid of paper. So do you foresee a time rather will they attach metal to paper again, or what would it take for metal to get back into circulation in the consumer hand and your hands and everyday transactions?
I think the only two ways that might happen, Michael, is if there's a collapse of the system and people choose to use probably not gold, but silver can be, minted into small rounds, and there's the junk silver with the dimes and the quarters that are 90% silver. People can decide to use that on their own, almost in a form of barter. I think that the current banking structure would never, because it takes kind of all of the tools out of their hands, try to back their currencies with metal. At least not the Western central banks, because they want the control. But another way it might happen is through kind of the blockchain technology, where people could use things like BitGold, where the gold and silver could be digitized and then used privately. But I don't see those types of initiatives being floated by central banks. When they talk about using blockchain technology, it just means they invent what they call money, and then they run it on the blockchain, but it's not necessarily backed by anything.
Right.
So central banks don't have an interest, at least the Western ones, in using gold and silver. Now, there may come a time where, as you mentioned earlier, Michael, where other countries may decide, in order to compete better with the dollar and get acceptance for their currencies, to do some sort of backing. But I think more likely, if people are to use gold and silver in the future, it'll be less because of a government initiative and more because of private payment systems that are being set up.
Right. Now, let's get into the precious metal side of things. I've noticed that on your site, you've done a good job of, kind of much charting how there's been runs on the mints globally, it seems like, where everyone is looking to get some precious metals in their hands. Can you explain why that is, and what does that look like, with these runs on the mint?
Yeah, I think it's probably not correct to say that they're runs, because while they are record numbers, if you look at it in perspective, last year, 47 million silver eagles were sold, a 1 ounce silver eagle. So that's 47 million ounces. That's a lot,
right?
Especially since in the 1999, 2000, they were selling 3 or 4. So it's a massive increase.
Right.
Same with the Canadian Mint. They sold 35, 40 million. They used to sell only a few million. But if you look back to the 60s, when governments used to issue coins like quarters, dimes, half dollars that were 90% silver, I did a blog post on this. In 1964, the U.S. government issued coins, and in order to issue those dimes, half dollars, and quarters made of 90% silver, they used 550 million ounces of silver just for general use. Now, they're selling us 47 million silver eagles. So it's a lot, but it's not that much. It's just that it's an increase off of basically almost nothing.
Right.
So I think it shows that there's some early adopters or people who are concerned about the dollar, concerned about financial systems collapsing. They're purchasing these larger silver, but in the grand scheme of things, it only amounts to about $1 billion worth of silver.
Right, at today's price, of course. Now, but I think the biggest thing is how it's interesting how everything seems to be ramping up over the last, say, decade or so. I myself am a late adopter of the whole monetary literacy, monetary awareness movement that's taking place now. And so I myself is starting to get into alternative means of storing my energy and wealth and things like that. So it's something that's picking up speed very rapidly. So that's what I meant by run on the mint. And so
I'm just pointing out that it still hasn't reached a large amount, because, yes, in 2006, overall silver demand was 5% for coins. That represented 5% of the overall silver demand. The rest was jewelry and industry. Now it's up to about 22, 23%, right, which is a big increase. So it's definitely on the increase. I'm just highlighting that it's still a relatively small percentage of the overall silver demand. And on a dollar basis, when you think about these companies that have no profits whatsoever and have market caps of $2, $3, $5 billion, lesser amounts of silver being purchased.
Yeah. Now, in your opinion, is there enough silver per se to go around for 300 million American citizens if need be? And is it something that's readily available?
Sure. I mean, it's the same with gold. People say there's not enough gold to back the monetary system. It's just a matter of price.
Right.
If at $12, $13 an ounce worth of silver, maybe not. But I mean, all you have to do is, if you get the price high enough, and there are 1 billion ounces worth of silver produced each year, or a little less than about 850 million. So there's enough silver. There's probably enough gold for everyday use, but there's probably enough silver for look, they used to have silver in the coins in Canada, Australia, England, the United States, in general circulation. People used to walk around with it in their pockets.
Yeah.
So there's clearly enough gold, enough silver.
Good point there. Now let's you hinted at price a little bit. Depending on what the price is. So let's just cover the price situation because I heard and kind of looking forward to the idea, I guess, of the price being set from out west or from out east rather. So do you think that I guess the Shanghai exchange, when that comes online and they start really trying to price some things to be more of a player in the game there, do you think it'll really change drastically or over time? What's your thoughts?
It depends, Michael, what China wants to do. Now, China has been accumulating gold. They're the number one gold producer, the number one in mining. They're the number one importer of gold. They're the number one consumer of gold. So lower prices kind of help them because if they want to consume gold, they don't want the price to go higher. Now, I think, though, once they have the Shanghai, the pricing mechanism set up there in yuan, they may wish, but maybe not immediately, to allow the price or to push the price higher, because once you've accumulated as much gold as you can, and it's harder to get more gold, and the amount of gold that you currently have is greater than the amount that you can get, then you want the value of your reserves in gold to be priced higher. So there could come a day where China might even unilaterally reset the price of gold higher in order to offset the declining value of their sales of U.S. Treasuries and the value of U.S. Treasuries, and therefore offset whatever losses they have in their overall reserves. That's possible. I don't think that's going to happen starting in April when they do the yuan gold fix, but it's clearly something that China has not had any participation really in other than their physical purchases in the pricing of gold, which doesn't make sense since, as we mentioned, they're the largest gold producer, consumer, and importer of gold. So they should have some more influence on the price of gold. And they're going to get some of that in April. But what I saw was the people working on the price fix initially in China are not the Western banks or the Chinese banks. So we have to see how many of those Western banks they can get to work on the yuan gold fix.
Right. Now, I asked my last guest this question. I think I'll ask you as well. The gold in Fort Knox. Is there anything in Fort Knox, or are there any hard, sound money reserves that the U.S. citizens can say that we have as well, or our nation has?
I mean, I have no way of knowing. My speculation is what I find confusing is the United States has had the same amount of gold, about 8,133 tons of gold, supposedly most of it in Fort Knox, some of it with the New York Federal Reserve. And they haven't added to it or subtracted to it since then. Mm-hmm. And now you would think that countries would, from time to time, add gold, maybe sell some gold. Supposedly the United States has just kept that static. They haven't audited the amount of gold they have in Fort Knox since the mid-50s. So it kind of raises suspicions as why don't you audit it? Why don't we talk about how much gold is there? You never hear the president, any of the presidents talk about gold. And the last president to talk about it was Nixon. And then I think Reagan discussed it when they were talking about a gold standard possibility when he took office. But if you read the minutes and the Federal Reserve speeches, you never hear them talk about gold. So it raised the question whether it's just sitting there and that's all that needs to be said, or whether it's gone, it's been rehypothecated. I don't know. I mean, there's a lot of theories out there. People are convinced it's not there. I'm not willing to say it's not there because I don't know. I haven't seen it.
Right, I understand. I just thought I would get your take on that because I think it's just something that's worth talking about that no one seems to talk about. Now, one of the last subjects I want to talk about before we kind of wrap this up is the national debt. Like it's a subject that a couple candidates have touched on, but where do you see the national debt? How high do you see it getting before there has to be a flushing of the system, or someone just says, "Hey, it's too high. Let's just wipe it clean and do what next?" What are your thoughts about that?
Well, I think the national debt. You hear countries talking about debt to GDP, and GDP doesn't pay off debt. GDP is just a number they make up. The more important number is tax revenue to debt, and clearly that's the difference. There's not as much tax revenue to cover the debt. unfortunately, the United States is no different than any of the other countries where they basically buy their growth through issuing debt. And it seems that they're able to keep doing that, and they have been able to do that. And that's kind of their preferred method of producing growth, is by issuing debt. I mean, the amount of QE that they did exceeded the nominal amount of GDP growth that we got during the entire periods of QE. So I don't know how long these things can go on. I've definitely been surprised how long it has gone on, where these countries can continue to rack up debt. And I think the reason is that the investment mindset is they view debt as an asset. I mean, if you think about all the countries that have U.S. treasuries, they view that as their reserves. But it's basically a debt obligation.
Right.
So I don't know. I'm just stunned that the world is set up this way with all this credit, and they just keep stacking more on and more on. And you mentioned the debt. The debt's only $19 trillion. The amount of money that the United States has to pay out for Medicare, Social Security, and so on is even greater. So some say $100, $200 trillion. There's no way they can pay that without either issuing more debt or just printing money.
Right. And so just the fact that, there's numbers that we can't really grasp right now in the trillions, it just lets you know that, how do you begin to repay it back? So obviously that's not the intention to repay that back.
Exactly. There's no intention to pay it back. It can never be paid back. But because those numbers are so large, there's not enough production and value in the world to pay it back.
You can't even tax everyone, their entire salary to even touch it.
Right. It's not even just taxing the 1%. You can tax everybody.
Yeah, so everyone will work to pay off the debt, still will get paid. But now, coming down the home stretch here, the gold to silver ratio. Right now, it's 180. I forgot what it is, but it's very, very high. There's a very wide margin. Do you foresee in the next, year or two, in your opinion, it, shrinking a little bit to where it's more, according to what it is coming out the ground? Or what are your thoughts?
I think so. I think the reason right now it's so high is that in times of monetary stress or financial stress, people go to gold. Gold is a much larger, more liquid market. It's basically a monetary metal. It's not a part industry. So gold holds on to its value during lower times, doesn't go as low as silver does. And then at the beginning of a bull market, gold moves first, I think, because people look at it as the go-to metal for monetary. Then I think what happens is, as gold holds its gains, starts to move up and gets expensive, people start to look to silver and rediscover its monetary side, and money moves into silver. And what happens when money moves into silver, because we talked earlier, the market is so small that the price just skyrockets.
Right.
So we saw what happened when silver moved from $8 in 2008 up to $50 in 2011. It blew right past gold, and gold only went from 800 to 1900. But since 2011, gold went from 1900, to 1100. Silver went from 50 down to 12. Right. So silver falls off the cliff during a bear market, but also rockets higher than gold in a bull market. So yeah, I think that ratio will has probably hit its peak, and you'll start to see silver play catch up as long as gold continues to consolidate its gains and move higher. Then silver will start to play catch up, and then quick, fast, and in a hurry, it'll, on a percentage basis, rise faster than gold, if indeed gold is going to go higher.
Right. Now, this whole idea of rethinking the dollar is about education. So you've done a good job of kind of giving us the rundown and your perspective on metals and the dollar. Now, what would you recommend, if anything comes to mind, on a possible book that it might have impacted you and helped you along your monetary journey to becoming, the expert that you are today? Anything come to mind that you might want to share with those who might just be learning or hearing about this whole concept for the first time?
It's interesting, Michael. I learned basically through so many different sources, it's almost impossible to mention them, and it's been an ongoing kind of education. Mm-hmm. I guess the only thing I can say is you start at my site, only not because my site is the best, but because my site reflects all that learning that I've had. And I also do put in the footnotes or further reading, so you can get from smallgold.com further education. And I have on my on the sidebar, I have an Amazon store where I sell the books that I was, that influenced me.
Right, I saw that. So definitely I'll make note of that in the notes below. And so last question. I will be, remiss not to ask you your opinion on the Federal Reserve note, or AKA the dollar, what will it look like in 2, 5, say 10 years?
Well, a lot of people are cheerleading for the dollar to collapse. And there's books about it and so on. I think people don't realize that if the dollar were to collapse and there is no other means of exchange that's globally accepted, that's a problem. So I think the dollar won't collapse. I think it may lose some value, but it's just impossible for me to say how long a debt-based currency globally can continue to exist when basically that's how all the other currencies are.
Right.
So I don't foresee, because I don't know what could possibly happen to throw it off other than more debt. But we've seen more debt and more debt and more debt, and the dollar's still there. In fact, the dollar is at a higher rate against the other currencies. The U.S. dollar index is higher today than it was when it started QE.
Right.
And you would think after 6 years of QE, $4 trillion of money printing, the dollar would have lost value. It didn't.
Yeah. Everyone around the world is running towards it. And so long as they continue to run towards it, I think it's going to continue to, give people confidence that it's stable and sturdy. And so, yeah, so it buys us Westerners a little time to make preparations and to educate ourselves.
I agree.
And so I'm very, very thankful that I came across, this message and have a chance to talk with you. So, Louis Cammarosano, as you said earlier.
Molto bene, Michael.
So give the audience a way to get connected with you. Give us your social media handles and things like that so guys can get in tune with what you got going on.
Oh, thank you, Michael. I'm on Twitter at Smallgold, SMAULGLD. I'm also on Google+, Facebook. My site is smallgold.com. If you go there, I have a free subscription. You just sign up, send your email address to me, and I will send you for free every article that comes out that I publish. And I publish about 2 to 3 times a week, so it's not like you're going to get a lot of emails coming your way, but you'll get some decent charts and some decent analysis, I think.
Well,
at smallgold.com.
Sounds good. Louis, thank you for sitting down. Look forward to continue to follow your work and staying in touch, and hopefully have you on later on, and if things happen to change, and get your take on it then.
Well, thank you very much, Michael. I appreciate all your work, too.
Sounds good. Well, this concludes my conversation with Louis Cammarasano from smuggle.com. Hope you found this chat to be informative as well as educational. I want to encourage you to visit smuggle.com to stay in tune with more of Louis's work. And also, scroll below, leave us a comment. I would love to hear your thoughts on this interview. Click the subscribe button for more RTD interviews and monetary news updates. And also, if you felt this was informative, feel free to share it. Looking forward to bringing you more interviews. See you next time. Thanks.